All right, Christians, today we're going to talk about violence in our stories and whether or not it should be there. If you've watched my other videos directed at Christian creatives, you probably have a good idea where this is going. If you didn't see my last video about Christian creatives being leaders and what that means for us, you might want to go back and watch that. That could provide some important context for this video. Many Christians have a problem with violence in media as a whole, but I'm here to tell you that as people who live in a fallen world, we need these elements in our stories. But of course, we're going to talk about where to draw the line. So, back in my video where I talk about messages and themes, I pull out a quote from a cognitive psychologist, Oatley, where he talks about stories being the mind's flight simulator for life. And it's no secret that the world is cruel and violent. There's no way to escape this fact in life, no matter how hard we might try. And there's actually consequences to ignoring it. Now, I'm not saying we can't have cozy, fun, lighthearted entertainment. Those are just as important. We need feel-good fiction. They help relieve the burden of life and they can lift our spirits, especially when we're feeling a little low. But we also need gritty fiction just as much to help us navigate life. So, as Christians, if we over sanitize our stories, we're leaving people woefully unprepared for the real world, and plus, it's a little boring. We need to help other Christians know how to deal with things like loss, evil, heartache, unforgiveness, a whole bunch of stuff in a biblical way. And what's worse, if we aren't tackling these issues in our fiction, only the world is giving it advice and how things should be handled. And that's dangerous and often really bad advice. So, yes, we do need to touch on topics that are dark, that are violent, and that make us uncomfortable. So, there's been a lot of interest in how media, especially video games, affects the level of violence in consumers and whether the violence in media actually does us harm. While most of the studies that have been conducted have been specifically on children, we can still use the results as a jumping off point for discussion regarding both children and adults. So, like all scientific studies that have to do with psychology, there are all kinds of variables we can't control. Otherwise, we would definitely fall into an unethical practice. But we can still see some trends that are pretty reliable. In the 1980s, they did a study on children who consumed a lot of violence in their entertainment. And these kids did tend to show a higher level of aggression when they were teenagers. They found that the children who watched a lot of violent TV when they were 8 years old were more likely to be arrested and prosecuted for criminal acts as adults. And this has been pretty consistent with other long-term studies of children to adults. And other research has found that exposure to media violence can desensitize people to violence in the real world. And that for some, violence actually becomes enjoyable and does not result in anxious thoughts that would be expected from seeing such imagery, which is its own problem. We should not be enjoying violence. See my last video about that. Now, you might be thinking, I thought you said violence is okay. That was a lot of evidence against violence. And that's where we talk about the line. These studies looked at extreme violence, which is different from general violence. There is a big difference between watching The Avengers and watching Sin City. Not all violence is created equal, and different degrees of violence affect individuals in different ways. To completely throw out all violence in all of its forms would be an overreaction that leaves people unprepared for the real world. After all, the Bible is full of violence. In an article about fictional violence, and I'll leave a reference to the articles that I read to support this video so you can check them out for yourselves. Don't take my word for it. In an article about fictional violence, the gist of what is said is that when a villain of a story kills, his actions are condemned. But when a hero kills, his actions are done so righteously. When I will add that when fiction preaches that violence is only acceptable to defend the good and the weak against the bad and the strong, that is where it's okay and is needed. Context matters. I need a t-shirt that just says context matters. Why does it matter? Context matters because of the narrative around the violence. What is the narrative saying? I need a t-shirt with that too. What does the narrative say? What is the story saying about violence? What levels of violence are acceptable? And most importantly, when is violence acceptable? Violence is sometimes needed to protect the weak and the innocent. It's not an aspect of life that we should ever celebrate. It's tragic, but it is an unfortunate byproduct of living in a fallen world. Violence that counters evil is beneficial in our stories, but we lose this benefit if the hero enjoys making their enemies suffer without narrative reprehension. We don't want the narrative to be encouraging and reveling in the enemy's demise, no matter how evil they are. Proverbs 24:17-18 even says not to rejoice when your enemy suffers, otherwise you risk displeasing God. Go read it for yourself. Now, this doesn't mean that your hero can't be relieved that the big evil is taken down and they can't continue in their evil ways anymore. This just means they shouldn't find joy in ending them. There is a difference. And on the other hand, violence that is used to suppress harm and subjugate should be condemned by the narrative. Our world faces all kinds of injustices, and we shouldn't ignore them. Now, the glorification of violence doesn't stop with just how the narrative plays out. The glorification of violence can also be done through how the violence is shown. I believe that violence can be shown on screen or described in a book to a certain extent to capture how evil and dark and to be realistic. But there is a certain line when you go from being realistic and giving the audience an idea of the circumstances that these characters are in and glorifying it. Then there's the line of glorifying it. If a major selling point to a piece of media is its violence, then we are now glorifying the violence and we're reveling in it. And as Christians, that's not something we should be doing. If consumers are getting excited about the violence, we've gone too far. And that's where the line is, glorifying violence. If our entertainment is encouraging violent fantasies, it isn't edifying. And Christians should stay away from it, and we shouldn't create it. It doesn't feed our souls in any productive way, and even science backs that prolonged exposure to this kind of content has negative effects on our minds and our behaviors. Enjoying violence is its own kind of problem. Violence, especially in its extremity, shouldn't make us excited. Finding enjoyment in suffering is a heart issue, and that as Christians, we would need to examine ourselves if we find ourselves enjoying it. And if you do find yourself having this problem, it's time to disengage from violent content for at least a while. So what does this mean for Christian consumers and creators? So is there a hard line? So unfortunately, I don't have a nice tidy line where I can say everything on this side of the line is bad and everything on this side is good. It's kind of where your personal discernment kind of comes in. Look for what the narrative says about the violence and how violence is being used in the story. Is the level of violence appropriate? Is the level of violence appropriate to the story, the age group, and is it being used with purpose? If it is, then we can generally engage with it and create and add it to our stories. But if it's being used in excess, if it's not appropriate for the age group and is being used to indulge in violent fantasies, then it's not good for our minds or our souls. Of course, you or someone close to you may have a low tolerance for violence, and that might be where you need to be a bit more strict about it, but we don't need to be afraid of using it purposefully in our storytelling. Next week, my brother's going to be joining me. We're going to be talking about tabletop RPG games and whether or not Christians should play them. You probably already know my answer, but subscribe so you don't miss the video next week.